Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to another installment of A Date with Darkness podcast. Super excited to be chatting with you here today, and I want to take some time to talk about the premise of this show is about narcissistic abuse and the effects of that, and I want to talk about adult children of narcissistic parents, and I feel like I've touched on that throughout the course of this show, but I specifically want to address challenges that adult children may face as a result of growing up with a narcissistic parent. And if you want to check out the blog on my website that I've written out on this, I'll also post that link in the show notes for you guys to check that out. And of course, if you are interested in counseling, coaching, individual or group coaching, visit drnataliejones.com for counseling sessions. And then there'll be a link in the show notes for the coaching. But let's move through it now that we've kind of gotten through some of the administrative stuff. And so, there are several types of adult children. There's adult children of alcoholics. There's just adult children of, dysfunctional families. And then, of course, the acronym A.C.O.N is for adult children of narcissists. And when you when you grow up in a family and you have parents that are narcissistic parents, they deter you away from your sense of autonomy or being an individual with unique needs, thoughts, and feelings. A narcissistic parent wants you to be complacent and compliant and in support of them and what they want and need always. And so if you were to shy away from that, become your own individual person, have your own unique experiences, your own unique identity and thoughts and feelings, that is typically frowned upon by a narcissistic parent. Narcissistic parents typically have these expectations of you, that you are a high achiever and your sole purpose, again, is to pour into them and their needs and their self-image. So a lot of what you do as a child is you were conditioned to seek that approval from your parents and try to measure up to their expectations. The challenges that you have with trying to measure up to a narcissistic parent's expectations is it's something that can never be met. And the reason why is because they always sort of change the goalpost in terms of measuring up. So, for example, you may be conditioned to believe that, if you get, for example, if you get straight A's or something on a report card, you might think that your parent they really will start to approve you and validate you and pat you on the back and say you're a great student if you make straight A's, right? And you think, okay, I go throughout my entire academic career being a high achiever, being a straight A student. And the challenge becomes when you, let's say you graduate high school, you graduate college, you graduate grad school, and you've done all these high achieving things. Well, you very quickly learn from a narcissistic parent, it doesn't even matter what you've done to, achieve all of those things. You still don't have their approval. In fact, what you may encounter is the abuse from that parent actually starts to become worse, because if you've out achieved them, or you're maybe on the same level, or they may view you as being a competition or a threat to them. And so that may cause them to definitely have feelings of jealousy or insecurity when it comes to them. And so what you actually might encounter if you do accomplish those super high goals is you may actually encounter them putting you down or trying to sabotage everything that you've accomplished, because they're actually much more resentful of you accomplishing those things. As a child of a narcissistic parent, what you may, and I'm, of course, as always, try to refer back to my notes because I want to make sure I hit some important points here. You typically, what children of narcissistic parents do is they seek to have a genuine bona fide relationship with their abuser. Again, going back up to, trying to meet their parents' expectations, right? And trying to take an interest in whatever their parents have interest in, and just trying to, again, overcompensate and do things right, because as a child, you want to be connected with your parents. Human beings at the core are wired for attachment, straight from birth. There's very little exceptions to that rule, but we are wired to be attached to maternal and paternal figures. And so in our minds, cognitively, neurologically, biologically, we do everything to try and obtain that. And so we move heaven and earth to measure up to, whatever it is our parents want from us in terms of relationships, right? And so we try to measure up to those ever-changing goalposts. We overcompensate to make up for the deficiencies in the relationship. And what that means is if that parent is not meeting our emotional needs, we may at some point condition ourselves to believe, well, that's okay, I don't need that, or I can create these stories to fill in the blanks as to why this person isn't meeting my needs. So I create this narrative in my mind. Oh, my mother works too much, or my father's got a lot on his plate, and or maybe they're having some financial challenges, and so they can't be there for me right now. But I know in their heart of hearts, they actually want to show up for me. And so a lot of times we try to overcompensate by creating these narratives that we just do this as a way to self-soothe, because it's much easier for a child of a narcissist to internalize blame and internalize the narrative of I'm not lovable, as opposed to admitting that, hey, maybe my parent isn't a good person, or maybe my parent doesn't love me, or maybe my parent just is half-assing it and doesn't want a relationship with me, right? Or they're not invested in me. And so it's a much easier narrative and a much easier workaround for a lot of people to kind of create these narratives, create the stories, and try to overcompensate in these ways, as opposed to admitting the truth or stating the facts of the behaviors that they see and that they experience. When you have a parent that is a narcissist, they can be very mean, they can be cold-hearted, they can be cruel, they can attack, they can undermine, they can sabotage, and not be very good to you. And that is abusive. It's essentially emotionally, psychologically, it could be financially, it could be physically, sexually, digitally abusive, right? And so there's all these different forms of abuse that take place. And very similar research shows that very similar, that our brains, yeah, the human body is really very resilient. But here's another way in where the resiliency of the human body really shows up as a way to try to protect us. Research shows that neurologically, when we're in a relationship with an abusive parent or an abuser in general, that our brain chemistry and our brain patterns um, are they show up very similar, like it looks very similar to a soldier who's in a combat war. And a lot of times we do exactly what people who are, combat veterans who are exposed to develop PTSD. Our brain changes neurologically very similar to that pattern as someone who has PTSD, because that's essentially what is happening relationally. You are developing PTSD, or complex PTSD is what it's called when it affects your interpersonal relationships. And what we do, what adult children of narcissists typically do when they're in these emotionally or psychologically abusive relationships, and they do it unconsciously, is they develop this emotional numbness. When I did my dissertation study, I interviewed these women who were abused by their mothers, and I remember one specific woman talking about how, when she and her mother, she didn't like her mother at all. And when she and her mother, like, for example, when she took her mother to the store, to like Walmart or whatever, she would check out. Like, she would be in the car, and it's very hard for her to sit in the car and be able to self-regulate because it was very uncomfortable. Her mother would start calling her names or create this sort of negative startup conversation. It was very hard for her to sit in the car, but she would kind of suffer through it. And one of the ways she would do it is she would try to turn the radio up really loud to try to tune out whatever her mother was saying, or she would just like check out in her mind and like mentally go somewhere else so that she wouldn't have to listen to that. And so that's a lot of times what we do without even knowing it, is that we train ourselves to like check out mentally and emotionally. And a lot of times, you can always tell, because when I work with clients and I ask them to check in, like, how are you feeling? What emotion are you feeling right now? It's like they can't even identify that, right? They have trouble identifying it on an emotional or feeling level. And a lot of times, what you may do is you may identify your emotions on an intellectual level, right? Like you intellectually, you might say, oh, I'm just, I'm checked out, or I'm not, but you can't really identify emotions, like I'm feeling sad, or something like that. And so there's a lot of trouble with self-regulating and identify how you feel. And that it works as a double-edged sword, because if you have trouble with connecting to yourself and checking in with yourself, how do you think that shows up when you're trying to connect with other people, right? Emotionally healthy and stable people, right? Because our emotions and our feelings, they teach us about situations that are unhealthy or healthy for us, right? They alert us to when you're feeling good, but they also alert us to when you're in a dangerous situation, or a situation that's very toxic and unhealthy for you, right? And if you're checked out, there's a good chance that you're going to oftentimes find yourself in more toxic situations than not, right? Because you're so checked out, or you're programmed to sort of dull down how you're feeling, right? And again, if you go back to thinking about narcissistic parents, a lot of times they don't check in to see how you're feeling, or they don't care how you're feeling, because they want subordination, or they want you to fall in line with how they're feeling, right? They're very selfish, and they want you to be more concerned with how they're feeling, or how you made them feel as a result of your actions. And so, you may be checking out, which, that in the long term, that can affect your ability to get close to people, or allow people to get close to you. They can't get a read on you, or you may be checking out because a part of it is like, you don't know who to trust. You can't trust yourself with your feelings, and therefore you may have some challenges with trusting other people, and trusting that they're not going to harm you or in some way, or there's not some ulterior motive or agenda, where that can come back to bite you. We may tend to ignore signals for danger as a result of that, right? Because of our alarm system has been disconnected or deactivated. We ignore signals for danger. We also may mistake, mundane things for kindness, or manipulation for kindness. One example of this would be if a narcissist apologizes, right? And on the surface, it may sound genuine, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I hurt your feelings, because I did X, Y, and Z to you." But you have to look at, when you're looking at a narcissist, right? They're only apologetic or sorry for the moment, and oftentimes those apologies, or those attempts to say that they're sorry, it's for secondary gain, one, and two, it's only for the moment, right? And it's just like, their lips are moving, but there's no authenticity behind that. But if you were checked out emotionally, conditioned yourself to really want a relationship with a toxic parent, what will tend to happen is you will do the work. Here's where that overcompensation comes in, and you will fill in the blank, and you will actually condition yourself to believe that they're authentic, or that they're trying to make an effort, and so I have to kind of take them at their word because they said that, even if their actions are contradictory to that apology, or counterintuitive to that apology. If they're doing the opposite, that their actions suggest that they're not sorry, or their actions suggest that they're actually hurting you, even if they're saying, "I'm sorry, I don't mean to hurt you," you may ignore what their actions are telling you. And again, sort of fill in the blank, because up here, and I mean, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with logic. The heart and the brain are not one and the same, because the heart wants connection. The brain may register it as dangerous, but again, if the heart is stronger, right? And a lot of times we do foolish things that don't make sense for love, but if the heart connection is stronger, and the desire to want to be connected to someone, if we've told ourselves, well, we only have one mother, we only have one father, and this and that, and you may have this other sort of outside conditioning from other relatives, and to sort of reinforce that, then you may ignore what your brain is telling you. And it's not for the fact that you want to hurt yourself. It's just because you want desperately to believe in something. You want desperately to feel love or connected, because the alternative narrative, again, may be too hurtful, or you don't know any other way to live your life, right? And believing in a truth narrative, right? Because that's the other thing, is you have to look at what the consequences of the truth would mean for you. And a lot of times for people, the consequences of the truth can be very devastating. And so the saying, ignorance is bliss, is there for a reason, because sometimes it really does feel like that's the best alternative for a person at that certain moment. When you have a relationship with a narcissistic parent, and a lot of times when I work with my clients, client, I teach them that there's a ripple effect. When you're used to being in a relationship with these strong polarizing personalities, there's a ripple effect, meaning that there's a higher probability that a lot of the other relationships, marriages, friendships, jobs, and other things, dynamics that you have in your life, they're going to also demonstrate or reflect that, and they're also going to be very toxic or narcissistic to you as well. And as a matter of fact, when we work on healing from narcissistic abuse, a lot of the undoing, or a lot of what sort of comes to light to people is like, oh my gosh, you know, as I'm working on healing, I'm starting to see how toxic these other relationships are too. And again, that goes back to that conditioning, because how we show up with our parents is that becomes our reality, and that becomes a strong conditioning and programming for how we move through life. So it's not uncommon for you to attract narcissistic people in other situations, right? Because again, we go back to um you know that that conditioning and that programming that we've had from birth, where we may have been manipulated or gaslighted for years into believing or acting, believing certain things or acting certain ways. The other thing too, to kind of, piggyback on that, is a lot of times, if you're a child of a narcissistic parent, a lot of times what narcissistic parents will do is um they will coax you or coerce you into dangerous situations or relationships with people. So they will actually, they may encourage you to be in relationships with abusers, or they may, because they may not be prejudiced, or they could, in terms of abusers, or right, they may align with another abuser's thinking, or again, if they're trying to sabotage you or harm you, or they're being manipulative in that way, they will encourage you to be in other relationships that may bring you down, again, be counterintuitive, and put you at a disadvantage. So they may actually coax you into dangerous situations, because again, going back to the parents may program you not to have boundaries. They program you not to be self-protective. They program you to not have feelings on your own and have your own autonomy, right? And so everything they teach you how to do is for the benefit of them. And so and it's never for your own personal benefit. Just that's something to be mindful of. And if they're doing that, again, it's not uncommon for you to have a job with a toxic boss or a toxic work culture. It's not uncommon for you to maybe be married to a narcissist. It's not uncommon for you to have narcissistic friends, or, other narcissistic relationships where you're being taken advantage of, or you may be attracting people that are where the relationship is completely one-sided. People in your life may be unstable, right? Because you're programmed to be a caretaker. You're programmed to be a problem solver. You're programmed to do the brunt of the work in your relationship, right? And so it's not uncommon for you to have these one-sided selfish relationships where your needs aren't being met, recognized, or ever being asked about. There's a lot of children of narcissistic parents that I know that are very successful, that do a lot of great and wonderful things. But because they were never acknowledged by their parents, or their parents never inquired, their parents never rooted them on or never acknowledged them in a way. Again, that's a conditioning that they take with them throughout life. And so how that may show up in real life is that you don't acknowledge yourself, you don't acknowledge your feelings, you don't acknowledge your emotions, you don't acknowledge the good things that happen to you, you don't acknowledge bad things. And so you may not, you may have these huge milestones that you accomplish. But again, if you're used to having parents that sort of change the goalposts, an accomplishment is just a check box, right? It's like you check the box and then you move on, but you don't ever really acknowledge yourself. You don't acknowledge the the process or what you went through in order to accomplish that goal. So it's like, oh, I did this, check, and it's like nothing. You may dismiss it. And so that's another thing, is learning how to, celebrate yourself, acknowledge yourself, the good, the bad, the ugly. All of those things are worth noting. But most importantly, acknowledging how wonderful of a person you are, how you've had these great accomplishments, or celebrating your birthday or celebrating anniversaries or things like that. Just doing something to acknowledge yourself, right? And so I think that's another thing to mention here. Children of narcissistic parents oftentimes, again, develop these problematic coping skills. And that's where, you know, things like alcoholism, drug use, retail therapy, excessively avoiding things, excessive reading may come into place. Is that, we children of narcissistic parents learn to adjust to stressful situations by doing these um, independent, self-soothing measures, right? Things that help them just mentally check out, right? Or avoid chaos as much as possible, right? And so some of those things, again, like I said, could be alcoholism, it could be drug use, it could be sex, it could be spending excessively, things like that. And oftentimes um, people who have problems with money is a good example, right? Because when you spend excessively, spending is a reflection of how you're able to cope with your emotions. And if you can't maintain control of finances, it oftentimes reflects that that person is also a person who's not in control of their emotions. And so, and I also mentioned reading. Reading is a great thing to do on a whole. But there is such a thing as avoidance. And a lot of times, what children of chaotic homes and narcissistic families will do is they will try to use some form of escapism when you're in a chaotic environment. And a lot of times, how that translates is into academia, right? And reading, because that's what books are great for, right? Especially if you're into action, adventure, or some sort of great sci-fi book, is those books can literally take you to another place where you could just check out for hours and be somewhere else. But that is a form of escapism and avoidance. And people carry that into their adult lives. You see people that are students for life, is what I call them. You have people that sort of go to school year after year. They try to get this degree and that degree and this degree and that degree without ever really sort of utilizing it, or um, without ever just, having life or even building up their personal relationships. They could be a perpetual student. And that is a method of avoidance. And I stand by that. And I know that, there may be some, controversy around that, but there's other forms of avoidance that we may use to try to avoid relationships or avoid sitting with ourselves and our own emotions. All right. Because sitting with yourself can be hard to do if you don't trust yourself, if you feel like you've got low self-esteem, or, you don't have boundaries, or you're unable to discern between your relationships. That can be challenging. and it is very challenging for people to do. And so you learn how to use escapism to just try to regulate, just try to make it to the next day, the next moment, the next hour. And so avoidance can be huge for people. And so those are some of the things that adult children of narcissists go through. And I want to let you know there are definitely online, in addition to what I offered for my services, counseling, coaching, etc. There are adult online support groups. I don't know if there are. Used to be prior to COVID, there would be meetings very similar to adult children of alcoholic meetings and things like that. I don't know if they are doing too many of those meetings in person anymore, but there certainly is online support meetings for that. And so I'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes. Of course, there are some wonderful literature. There's some wonderful literature out there for adult children of alcoholics, and I'll definitely post some books there in the show notes for you guys to tune into. Therapy is also a great resource tool that I encourage a lot of you to use. Another resource that I encourage you to think about as you're listening to this episode is writing. I love to write, and journaling is great, especially if you are a person that has trouble identifying emotions and feelings. In fact, if you are one of those people that has trouble with identifying emotions or feelings, or you don't know how you're feeling, I encourage you to Google a feelings chart or a feelings wheel. Those are free, and they have this great big plethora of chart of feelings, of emotions and things like that. And I encourage you to get in the habit of maybe looking at that at least once or twice a day and checking in with yourself and seeing how you're doing. But also encourage you to take time, even if it's 10 or 15 minutes a day, or at least a couple times a week, where you're sort of writing out thoughts and feelings that you may have. How do you feel about your parents? How do you feel about some of the experiences that you went through with your parents? How has your experiences with your parents affected you throughout your adult life? Do you enjoy your life? Do you feel like you have a good quality of life? And I just want you to kind of think about some of those questions, and then think about, like, what do you want your life to look like? If you could snap your fingers and have a perfect world, what would the best relationships in your life look like? What would be perfect for you? What would make you feel really good about waking up every day and being a part of your life every day? And thinking about, if relationships are toxic, what makes specific relationships or environments toxic to you, and really start thinking about that and talking about that, even if you're just sort of talking about that to yourself. I also encourage you to do some things where that feel good, but that also can help you to self-regulate as well, so that you're not checked out, but you are checking in. Things that could help you check in. I like to use the five senses for that. So that with five senses would be taste, sight, hearing, smell, and feeling, right? So things that could help you sort of, you know, key into those senses would be things like painting, but maybe you would want to take like a class where you are around other people, right? And you could sort of talk about and show off your artwork. Maybe even a cooking class where you can do that, or just going out and being out in nature, where you could just sort of stop and take a look around you and enjoy the falling rain, or the color of the leaves, or the crashing waves at a beach, but where you are, you're checking in, you're taking in, and you are enjoying, but you're being very intentional about what you're doing, so that it's not a method of avoidance, but it's a way to sort of check in with yourself and regulate your senses. So, those are some quick tips that I have for you. And I hope that this has been helpful. And of course, love to continue the conversation on social media. If you've got some comments, questions, put them down in the chat box in the box. So I do look at those. And definitely connect with me on social media if you found this to be helpful. Help a small podcaster out. Be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're on YouTube, write a great review, subscribe, and share it with a fellow friend, family member, or foe that you think could benefit from this. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well.